Hello, I'm Steven Earnshaw. I'm going to be reading a short story called Whim, which is from my first collection, Memory Clinic. Whim. We found the meter man humourless and locked him in the cellar. At first, he didn't seem to realise because he was reading the gas and electric. And then he did realise when he couldn't get out and started banging on the door, though not as much as we thought he might. Our suspicions about his humourlessness were confirmed because he thought the whole thing might be a joke. So we had to explain we'd done it on a whim, which was different. This calmed him down somewhat, or made him think. After a while, he started banging again and shouting, perhaps annoyed that we were splitting hairs over whether it was a joke or a whim. We went out of the house for a bit because we couldn't stand the noise and re-entered quietly a couple of hours later. The meter man was silent. Hopefully, he had accepted his fate. The cat started fussing for its tea and we realised the mistake we'd made. The cat food was at the top of the cellar head, so we couldn't get it without opening the door and giving the meter man a chance to escape. We could try to ascertain if he was down the bottom of the cellar, quickly open the door, snatch the food, close and lock, but that seemed risky. It was obvious we hadn't thought the locking up of the meter man through, and we came close at that point, closer than we have ever been before or since, close to dreary domestic wrangling. What was happening to us? We were changing, transforming. We just couldn't seem to reconcile ourselves to the situation. But after a few days, we did reconcile ourselves, buying him more cat food, for instance, rather than wishing and hoping to get at the cellar-head cat food, which was now out of our hands. During those few days, a number of logical problems cropped up, which may have occurred to you as you've been listening. We had no wish to cause the meter man unnecessary distress through lack of food and water. Luckily, there is a coal chute into the cellar from outside. It has bars at the bottom of the chute to stop burglars breaking and entering, and now, as we realised, could just as easily function to stop people getting out. Through the gaps in the bars, we could throw down food and drink. As to pissing and shitting, he'd just have to live in his own filth. That was just the way it was, and he could fulfil his sexual needs by masturbating, if he was so inclined, which we suspected he was. If he got bored, he could read the meters. The other thing was that the cellar's at ground level, and there's a small dirty window which he could smash. We don't know what happened, but it didn't seem to occur to him to smash it and shout. Certainly it would be possible to break because there were bars in front of the glass, yet not impossible. In order that nobody could see or hear him through the small barred glass window, we blocked off the front entrance to our house and asked people to come round to the back of the house, which is not uncommon in this part of Yorkshire for some unfathomable reason. The gas and electric rang us to see if we'd been visited, which spooked us because then it occurred to us he might have a phone. That was something else we hadn't thought of. Why don't you phone him? We double bluffed. We've tried, they said, but his phone's switched off. So he didn't have it on him. Otherwise, he could have just phoned, couldn't he? They agreed. It seemed a rather pointless conversation after that. During those few days, even though we nearly changed at the point we came close to dreary domestic wrangling, we didn't actually change very much at all, and our mutual love continued unabated. We retained an air of smugness, which we had always enjoyed, to be honest, and found that very self-conceitedness to be enhanced, since we knew full well that the current poor economic climate and deteriorating environmental conditions outside had barely touched us. Our lives were continuing pretty much as before, and we really were enjoying having the meter man in the cellar, and thought it a good antidote to the recent past 2 or 3 years negative press regarding keeping people in cellars. We're talking about spring moving into summer here, just in case you need to get your chronological bearings. And typically we were getting April showers in June. What's happening to the weather? Everybody was asking at that time, I remember. It was one night about 2 weeks into our escapade when a funny thing happened. We were settled in bed waiting to enter the land of Nod when it started raining. Our bed is in the attic conversion, so the rain on the roof is quite noticeable. We got up to look out the window at the rain, but there was no rain. There was the sound of rain, but there was no rain. This spooked us, really spooked us. So we removed the access panel to the header tank, which is placed, in fact it's still there, above the headboard. With the panel gone, the noise got louder. It was too late to do anything about it that night. We could look into it again the next morning. Perhaps ask the meter man in the cellar if he had any ideas about what the cause of the noise of the rain was when we couldn't see any rain. We went to sleep wondering if there was such a thing as invisible rain, a rather fantastic idea which kept us amused and proved to be our passport to entering the land of Nod. Part of us, we were sure, hoped that the noise would simply disappear by morning. Was this too much to ask? If it hadn't gone by the morning, we might ask the meter man in the cellar if he had any ideas. We kept saying this to ourselves about asking the meter man in the cellar if he had any ideas for reassurance, replacing our usual nighttime repetitions. In a strange way that night, we came to rely on the meter man in the cellar. The next day, the noise was still there. We shouted down to the meter man if he had any ideas, which was partly our way of checking to see that he was still all right. He did shout back, which was good, but with unrelated responses, which was unhelpful. Having no luck there, we ran back up to the top of the house, removed the access panel again, and heard the noise louder than ever, sounding something like halfway between rain on the roof, it still wasn't raining, and something like a huge insect scraping away behind the insulation boards. It really was a puzzle. We discovered that banging on the boards stopped the noise for a short time, only for it to start up again, as if it had politely waited to see if our banging meant something and we were going to continue. Rather like the meter man in the cellar though, we couldn't just stay there banging forever. It was something we had to accept. Well, sort of. We phoned John and he came round to have a look. The most obvious solution, which he himself suggested, was that there was a wasp's nest behind the insulation boards. He went away after a cup of coffee and we phoned a pest control company. Carl hated Birmingham and the south. The noise, he said, was a wasp's nest in phase 2 of development, and he showed us a couple of the wasp babies. He said we were lucky it wasn't a bee's nest because they were now protected by law and couldn't be killed, only moved. What would we do then if it was a bee's nest, we asked, because it was not possible to get into the space behind the boards where the nest was. We were worried for some reason, even though it was a wasp's nest. Nothing, sleep where you can't hear it. They'd be gone by October, they wouldn't hurt you. The wasp's nest had to be killed off. The noise of rain was wasps chewing wood and insulation and making glue for the nest. Imagine just a few inches away from your head as you sleep. You can get up to 10,000 wasps in a nest, he said. As soon as he said that, we just wanted him to get the thing over and done with. He chatted a bit longer, said that people were looking for aliens in outer space when really wasps were aliens. And he said he thought there might be a problem with our drains. That was probably the piss and shit from the gas and electric meter man. We thought we'd masked the smell. And Carl got changed into his spacesuit and exploded something that killed off the nest. Hurrah! Part 2. He thought he could become the other gas man, the other one, now that all his neurons and protoplasm and cell walls were in place, as described in the biology primer left for him on top of the meter. The overwhelming problem was the arrangement of internal organs. These had been assembled carelessly, as if their minds were elsewhere. Still, now that he was resigned to his fate, he could concentrate on this. I miss making my own meat, he thought. These words interfered whenever he wanted to visualize his internal organs and mentally change the relations they had with each other. He missed making his own meat, but he didn't miss his wife, Helena. She had left the homeland rashly by train to go west. I have too much religion, she said to him when they first met one summer in a mini-mart in Kilburn, in the hope he would absolve her. I have strange ideas about marriage, he replied. Neither thing bothered the other because they were so much in love. When they married, these two very same things became the absolute focus of separate existences, and they descended into dreary days. She tried her hand at different jobs, but always came back to the comfort of Polish mini-marts, whereas he trained as a gasman in northern provincial towns, making his own meat from the numerous parks and hills that counted for geography. This, if nothing else, was approved by his wife, who could see God's order in the killing of non-human species. His idea of marriage was more religious than hers, a surprise to her, but not to him, because he had always felt the need to be uxorious, to have a different way of being himself, as if being a husband would liberate him from who or what he had been before, since that was the self that bored him. She immersed herself in Decalogue, and although he avoided it, he couldn't escape dreaming scenes of adultery and coveting and idolatry and state retribution and living in Polish flats. A close-up of the lawyer who failed to save the young murderer from legal hanging haunted him, emerging from his car into the field of lost childhood to scream, "I abhor it, I abhor it." Now this was the it to be abhorred. The gasman's only release from the insinuations of the films was doing what he loved most, going into other people's houses without being obliged to stay there. The one activity, the other side of ennui, reading numbers underground, tracing at his mind's eye the path of gas as it moved vast distances through the Atlantic to make ovens and fires glow, believing in the corporate magic that held the network together, as if God had planned it all to be just this way and no other. Being locked in a cellar was his fate, which he soon embraced. It was time to commit to one house, the fate of all gasmen. He had no abiding interest in electricity. "I abhor it, I abhor it," he screamed back when asked about noises in the attic he would never see, a place he imagined as the kingdom of Poland in miniature, with the incarcerating man and woman sufficient to play all the actors in all the films in all the apartments. He watched the dial measure the flow of gas from the Atlantic, mentally and spiritually reducing the height of all the seas in all the world as he did so. What most impressed the gasman was the way his liberation from domesticity had been so carefully planned by the ambitious young couple overhead. In the cellar was a mess carefully arranged for him to start rebuilding his life in any way he saw fit. When one morning after many mornings the fascination of the dials wore off, he turned his attention to the large mound of earth which the builders had failed to clear some 100 years ago. It doubled up as a meteorite and sometimes bee's nest from which he could garner honey. The shadow of visitors to other houses continued to project into the cellar through the small barred window and onto the chaos and mound, which were gradually taking shape into a telling new world. Why did nobody try to save him? Perhaps his wife had accepted her widow fate as it had been coded into the Decalogue. Perhaps she had remained, chosen a priest this time, or the opposite of priests. These days his mind wandered and he scarcely considered how his internal organs were to be rearranged and how he was to become the other gasman. He needed to retrain his mind. As he remembers it from Genesis, all his cells and tissue and neuronal activity are just like the other man's. This is the easy part though, the end.